Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha sits in his command tent watching smoke rise over Vienna. It's August 1683, and his army of 150,000 warriors has surrounded the city for nearly 2 months. The walls are crumbling, the defenders are starving. Victory is days away. Then a messenger bursts through the tent flaps, gasping for air. The relief army, they're here. The Polish king, he's brought 70,000 men. Kara Mustafa doesn't panic. He's fought in 17 campaigns. He's never lost. He looks at the messenger with cold contempt and says, "Let them come. We have dug trenches 15 feet deep. We have artillery that can shatter stone. We command the greatest military machine the world has ever seen." Then he makes a decision that will haunt military academies for centuries. Instead of abandoning the siege and positioning his army for field battle, he keeps digging tunnels under Vienna's walls. He believes he can win on 2 fronts simultaneously. He's wrong. 3 days later, 60,000 Ottoman warriors lie dead or dying on a hillside outside Vienna. The Grand Vizier flees for his life. The Sultan will have him strangled with a silk cord for this failure. And the Ottoman Empire, the superpower that had terrified Europe for 300 years, begins a terminal decline it will never recover from. This isn't a Hollywood battle where good triumphs over evil. This is the story of how strategic arrogance, political miscalculation, and one cavalry charge destroyed the most powerful military force in the world. This is the Siege of Vienna, 1683. Before we dive into the forgotten details of this apocalyptic confrontation, if you enjoy learning about the pivotal battles that shaped world history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're watching from and which historical siege you'd like me to cover next. The man commanding this war machine, Kara Mustafa Pasha, wasn't some bloodthirsty warlord. He was a calculating strategist who had climbed to the position of Grand Vizier through political skill and military success. He spoke multiple languages, collected rare manuscripts, and patronized poets and scholars. He also commanded loyalty from veterans who had fought from the Caucasus to the Mediterranean. When he decided to march on Vienna, it wasn't religious fanaticism. It was cold strategic calculation. Vienna represented the gateway to Catholic Europe. If Vienna fell, the road to Rome lay open. More importantly, the Holy Roman Empire would fracture. The Habsburg dynasty would collapse. The balance of power in Europe would tilt permanently toward Ottoman dominance. This wasn't about converting Christians or spreading Islam. This was about power, territory, and the geopolitics of empire building. So when we talk about Vienna, we're not talking about good versus evil. We're talking about one empire trying to destroy another. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides enslaved prisoners. Both sides saw civilians as collateral damage. The difference is that one side won, wrote the history books, and convinced generations of students that they were the heroes of this story. Let's rewind to the spring of 1683 and watch how the greatest military disaster in Ottoman history was actually set in motion by the Sultan's own ambition. Sultan Mehmed IV was not a warrior. He was a hunter who spent more time tracking deer in Thrace than reviewing battle plans in Istanbul. But he was obsessed with legacy. His great-great-grandfather was Suleiman the Magnificent, who had besieged Vienna in 1529 and nearly taken it. Mehmed wanted that glory for himself. He wanted history to remember him as the Sultan who finally conquered Vienna and opened Central Europe to Ottoman rule. In March 1683, he summoned Kara Mustafa to the palace and gave him explicit orders: take Vienna, do whatever it takes. Kara Mustafa understood the stakes. Success would make him the most powerful man in the empire. Failure would mean execution. But he also saw an opportunity. The Habsburg Empire was weak. Emperor Leopold I had been fighting wars on multiple fronts. France, under Louis XIV, was pressuring the Habsburgs from the west. The Hungarian nobility was in revolt against Habsburg rule. Many Hungarian magnates had already pledged support to the Ottomans. This was the perfect moment to strike. Kara Mustafa began assembling an army unlike anything Europe had seen since the days of Genghis Khan. From every corner of the empire, soldiers converged on the assembly point in Edirne. The core force consisted of the Janissaries, elite infantry troops recruited through the Devsheim system, Christian boys taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be the Sultan's personal soldiers. These weren't conscripts. They were professionals who had spent their entire lives preparing for war. They marched in formation, They followed complex battlefield maneuvers, and they viewed death in battle as the highest honor. Supporting the Janissaries were the Sipahi cavalry, feudal horsemen who received land grants in exchange for military service. Unlike European knights, who were often undisciplined and individualistic, the Sipahis operated as coordinated units. They could execute flanking maneuvers, feigned retreats, and devastating charges with precision that European cavalry couldn't match. Then came the artillery. The Ottomans had been at the forefront of gunpowder warfare since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. By 1683, their artillery corps could field hundreds of cannons, from massive siege guns that could fire stone balls weighing over 600 pounds to lighter field pieces that could be moved rapidly during battle. But the army wasn't just soldiers. Kara Mustafa brought engineers, miners, sappers, blacksmiths, carpenters, surgeons, imams, cooks, and a mobile city of support personnel. The baggage train alone stretched for miles. They brought food, ammunition, replacement weapons, tents, medical supplies, and even luxury goods for the officers. This wasn't a raiding party. This was an invasion force designed to sustain a prolonged campaign. In April, the army began its march. They moved northwest through Ottoman Bulgaria, crossed into Ottoman Hungary, and headed toward the Habsburg border. Spies sent word ahead to Vienna. The city began preparing for siege. Emperor Leopold I faced an impossible choice: stay and defend Vienna, potentially getting trapped and captured, or flee and abandon his capital to the enemy. He chose survival over symbolism. On July 7th, Leopold fled Vienna with his family and most of the court, heading west toward Passau and then Linz. He left behind a garrison of approximately 15,000 men under the command of Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a veteran officer who had fought the Ottomans before. Starhemberg understood siege warfare. He had maybe 8 weeks before the Ottoman army arrived. He used every day. Workers reinforced the medieval walls with earthwork bastions. Engineers prepared countermining tunnels. Artisans cast new cannons and stockpiled ammunition. Citizens who couldn't fight were evacuated. Food supplies were inventoried and rationed. Hospitals were established. Firefighting equipment was positioned throughout the city. Starhemberg wasn't preparing for battle. He was preparing for survival. The Ottoman army reached the outskirts of Vienna on July 14th. Kara Mustafa established his command tent on a hill overlooking the city and surveyed the defenses. Vienna's walls were old, built before the age of gunpowder artillery, but the recent earthwork modifications made them more formidable. The city was surrounded by the Danube River on the north and east, providing natural protection on those sides. The western approaches offered the best attack route, but they were now defended by newly constructed bastions and a water-filled moat. Kara Mustafa made his first critical mistake. Instead of attempting a quick assault while the defenders were still organizing, he decided on a methodical siege. He believed Vienna would fall without a major battle if he could simply starve them out and breach the walls through mining operations. This was textbook siege doctrine, and it had worked for the Ottomans many times before, but it required time, and time was the one resource Kara Mustafa couldn't afford to waste. Why? Because everyone in Europe knew the Ottomans were coming. Emperor Leopold had sent desperate letters to every Catholic monarch in Europe, begging for help. He appealed to the Pope, to the King of Poland, to the German princes, to anyone who would listen. Most ignored him. France, under Louis XIV, was actually allied with the Ottomans through diplomatic arrangements. The French saw the Habsburgs as their primary rival and had no interest in saving Vienna. Most German princes were too busy fighting each other or watching warily as France expanded its borders. But one man responded: Jan III Sobieski, King of Poland. Sobieski was not acting out of religious conviction or European solidarity. He was acting out of strategic necessity. If Vienna fell and the Habsburgs collapsed, the Ottoman Empire would share a direct border with Poland. The Ottomans would become an existential threat to Polish independence. Better to fight them in Austria than in Poland. In April, Sobieski signed a mutual defense treaty with Leopold. If either ruler was attacked, the other would send military aid. It was a pragmatic alliance born of shared danger. But assembling an army takes time. Sobieski needed to mobilize Polish forces, coordinate with whatever German princes were willing to help, and march hundreds of miles to Vienna. That would take months. Everything depended on whether Vienna could hold out long enough for the relief force to arrive. Back at the siege, Kara Mustafa began the grinding work of breaking the city. Ottoman engineers started digging approach trenches, zigzagging lines that slowly crept toward the walls, while providing cover from defensive fire. Every night, sappers dug closer. Every day, artillery pounded specific sections of wall, trying to create breaches. The defenders fired back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Ottoman cannons kept firing even when the defenders' guns fell silent from lack of ammunition. Then, the mining began. This was the true art of siege warfare in the 17th century. Engineers would dig tunnels under enemy walls, support the tunnel roof with wooden beams, fill the tunnel with gunpowder, and detonate the explosive to collapse both the tunnel and the wall above it. If done correctly, mining could create massive breaches that made walls indefensible. The Ottomans were masters of this technique. The defenders knew the Ottomans were mining. They could hear the digging. Starhemberg organized counter-mining operations, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Ottoman mines before they reached the walls. These underground battles were nightmarish. Soldiers would break into enemy tunnels and fight hand-to-hand in pitch-black spaces, barely wide enough to crawl through. Sometimes defenders would detonate their own explosives to collapse Ottoman tunnels, burying the miners alive. Sometimes the Ottomans would break into Austrian tunnels and engage in brutal close-quarters combat with picks, shovels, and knives. Above ground, the city was dying slowly. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread, artillery bombardment killed civilians and soldiers alike. Buildings caught fire from explosive shells. The smell of death permeated the streets. Morale began to crack. Starhemberg maintained discipline through a combination of inspiration and fear. Soldiers caught abandoning their posts were hanged, but he also shared the hardships of his men, sleeping in the fortifications, eating the same rations, personally inspecting every section of wall. By August, the Ottomans had made significant progress. They had breached the outer walls in several places. Their trenches had reached the edge of the moat. One more major mining operation, and they would be inside the city. Kara Mustafa was confident. Victory was imminent. His spies reported that Leopold's relief army was still assembling. They wouldn't arrive in time. Vienna would fall, and the Grand Vizier would claim his place in history. But he had fatally underestimated how long the defenders could hold out, and how quickly Sobieski could move. The Polish king was not following the cautious, methodical approach typical of 17th century warfare. He was taking risks. He forced marches. He coordinated with the imperial forces and the German contingents with aggressive efficiency. On August 31st, scouts reported to Kara Mustafa that the relief army was approaching. They numbered approximately 70,000 men, 27,000 Poles under Sobieski, 23,000 imperial troops under Charles of Lorraine, and another 20,000 from various German states. This brings us to Kara Mustafa's second and most catastrophic mistake. A competent general in his position would have immediately abandoned the siege, withdrawn his army to open ground, and prepared for a field battle. The Ottomans still had numerical superiority, around 150,000 troops versus 70,000 relief forces. In open battle, those numbers would matter. But Kara Mustafa refused to abandon the siege. He had spent 2 months digging trenches, building fortifications, positioning artillery, and wearing down the defenders. He was days, maybe hours, from breaking into the city. He couldn't accept that all that effort would be wasted. So he made a decision that military historians still study as a case study in strategic failure. He would continue the siege while simultaneously preparing to fight the relief army. He divided his forces. Approximately 90,000 would continue siege operations. 60,000 would position themselves to block the relief army's advance. He believed his fortified positions, his artillery superiority, and his veterans' discipline would be enough to hold off the attack until Vienna's walls finally collapsed. He was gambling everything on the assumption that the relief army would approach cautiously, engage in preliminary skirmishing, and give him time to either take Vienna or reposition his forces. That assumption was wrong. Sobieski had no intention of fighting a cautious, methodical battle. He was planning something audacious, risky, and completely unexpected. The relief army approached from the northwest, through the Vienna woods, a forested region of hills and valleys that provided cover from Ottoman scouts. On September 11th, the combined Christian forces took position on the Kallenberg Heights, overlooking Vienna and the Ottoman siege lines. They could see everything: sprawling Ottoman camps, the siege works, the trenches, the artillery positions. They could also see that the Ottomans were not properly prepared for a major battle. The Turkish forces were still in siege formation, not battle formation. Sobieski called a war council with the other commanders. Charles of Lorraine urged caution. They should probe the Ottoman defenses and plan a coordinated assault for the following day. But Sobieski looked at the situation and saw opportunity. The Ottomans were divided, disorganized, and psychologically unprepared for an immediate attack. He argued for an assault the next morning, September 12th. The other commanders reluctantly agreed. They would attack at dawn. That night was chaos in both camps. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg's garrison heard the cannons of the relief army and knew salvation was close. Soldiers who had been on the brink of collapse found new energy. In the Ottoman camps, confusion reigned. Kara Mustafa was receiving contradictory reports about the size and position of the relief army. Some scouts said 70,000. He still believed he could handle this situation, but he began repositioning troops, pulling some units from the siege lines to reinforce the forces facing the relief army. September 12, 1683. Dawn breaks over Vienna. The relief army begins its descent from the Kahlenberg heights. This is not a chaotic mob rushing into battle. This is a coordinated, three-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the Ottoman defensive positions through combined arms tactics. Charles of Lorraine commands the left flank, Imperial and Saxon troops moving down the slopes toward the Ottoman right wing. The center consists of German contingents, Holy Roman Imperial forces, and reinforcements from various German states. And on the right flank, positioned for maximum impact, is the Polish army under Sobieski himself. The Ottomans see them coming and form battle lines. The Janissaries take position in the center, their muskets ready. The Sipahi cavalry mass on the flanks, preparing to charge once the enemy infantry comes within range. Artillery crews load their cannons and adjust elevation. Kara Mustafa positions himself at the rear, where he can observe the entire battlefield and issue commands through runners and signal flags. The battle begins with artillery exchanges. Ottoman guns fire into the descending Christian forces, but the hilly terrain makes accurate firing difficult. Many shots miss or strike empty ground. The Christian forces, spreading out as they descend, minimize casualties from the artillery barrage. Then the infantry lines clash. The Imperial forces hit the Ottoman right wing like a hammer. Musket volleys thunder across the battlefield. Men fall screaming. Smoke obscures vision. Officers shout orders that can barely be heard over the roar of gunfire. The Ottomans hold. They've been in this position before. They know how to fight defensive battles. The Janissaries form squares, concentrating firepower and repelling the Imperial infantry's initial assault. The Sipahis launch countercharges, driving wedges into the Christian formations and forcing them to fall back. For several hours, it seems like the Ottoman defensive positions will hold. Kara Mustafa watches from his command post and allows himself a moment of satisfaction. They're holding. The Christians are taking heavier casualties. If this continues, the relief army will exhaust itself against Ottoman defenses, and then the counterattack can begin. But while the center and left flank grind into bloody stalemate, something is happening on the right flank that will change everything. Sobieski has positioned his Polish forces, including the famed Polish winged Hussars, on difficult terrain that delays their deployment. The Ottomans facing them are lighter cavalry units, Tatars and irregulars, not the elite Janissaries or Sipahis. The Polish cavalry slowly, methodically descends from the heights, forming up in attack formation. Now, we need to talk about the winged Hussars, because popular culture has turned them into mythological super soldiers. They weren't. They were heavy cavalry, armored horsemen trained for shock charges, similar to medieval knights, but adapted for 17th century warfare. What made them effective wasn't magic or superior martial arts. It was organization and doctrine. The Hussars fought in coordinated squadrons, not as individual heroes. They charged in wedge formations designed to penetrate enemy lines. And yes, many wore wings attached to their back armor, metal frames with eagle or ostrich feathers, which created a distinctive sound during charges and helped identify friendly units in the chaos of battle. The psychological impact of thousands of armored horsemen thundering toward you with wings creating a roaring sound was real, but the Hussars won battles through discipline and mass, not intimidation. By early afternoon, Sobieski has his cavalry in position. He surveys the battlefield and sees the opportunity. The Ottoman forces in front of him are disorganized, still trying to reposition from siege formation to battle formation. Their cavalry is scattered, their infantry is spread too thin. the Polish king makes his decision. He gives the order to charge. Imagine being an Ottoman Tatar horseman, watching 18,000 Polish cavalry emerge from the tree line and begin moving toward you. At first, it's a trot. The ground begins to vibrate. Officers are shouting, trying to organize a defensive formation, but there's not enough time. The Polish cavalry accelerates to a gallop. The noise is deafening, hooves striking earth like thunder, armor rattling, men shouting war cries, and above it all, the strange roaring sound of those wings cutting through the air. The Tatar cavalry tries to meet the charge, but they're lighter horsemen, designed for skirmishing and harassment, not head-on collisions with heavy cavalry. The impact when the Hussars hit is catastrophic. The Polish wedge formations punch through the Ottoman lines like a spear through cloth. Ottoman horsemen are thrown from their saddles. Infantry formations dissolve. Within minutes, the entire Ottoman left flank is collapsing. Sobieski doesn't stop. He reforms his cavalry and charges again, this time driving deeper into the Ottoman positions, aiming directly for Kara Mustafa's command center. The Polish cavalry sweeps across the battlefield like a wave, crushing everything in their path. Ottoman units that had been holding firm against the imperial forces on the left and center suddenly find themselves threatened from the flank and rear. Panic spreads. Kara Mustafa sees his army disintegrating. He orders his personal guard to prepare for retreat. His commanders are screaming conflicting reports. The left flank is gone. The center is holding but can't maintain position if the flanks collapse. The right is under massive pressure from the imperial forces. Units are routing. The carefully constructed defensive positions that were supposed to hold off the relief army are crumbling faster than Vienna's walls. The Grand Vizier makes his final decision. Retreat. Abandon the siege. Save whatever forces can be saved. He sends runners to order a general withdrawal, but in the chaos, many units never receive the command. Some Janissary units keep fighting, not realizing the battle is already lost. They die where they stand, maintaining discipline, even as the army around them disintegrates. The Polish cavalry reaches the Ottoman camp. This is where it becomes a slaughter. The siege camp isn't prepared for defense against cavalry. It's a sprawling city of tents, supply wagons, artillery parks, and civilians. Polish and imperial forces pour into the camp and begin killing everything that moves. Ottoman soldiers who threw down their weapons and tried to surrender were cut down. Wounded men were trampled. Camp followers, servants, and slaves were slaughtered indiscriminately. This wasn't chivalry or military honor. This was vengeance for 2 months of siege and terror. Sobieski's cavalry captures Kara Mustafa's command tent, the Grand Vizier's personal quarters, filled with luxuries that would have funded a small kingdom. Golden coffee pots, silk carpets, jeweled weapons, rare manuscripts, exotic birds in cages, and the Grand Vizier's personal treasury. The Polish soldiers begin looting immediately, stuffing their saddlebags with gold, silver, and gemstones. Officers try to maintain order, but it's impossible. The soldiers have been promised plunder, and plunder they will take. Back in Vienna, the garrison hears the sounds of battle shift. The Ottoman artillery falls silent. The siege works are abandoned. Starhemberg orders a sortie, sending his remaining troops out of the city to join the fighting. They fall upon the Ottoman rearguard and complete the destruction. By nightfall on September 12th, the Ottoman army is in full retreat. They leave behind thousands of dead, all their artillery, most of their supplies, and their reputation for invincibility. The casualty numbers are staggering. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 Ottoman soldiers died or were captured. The Christian coalition lost approximately 4,000 killed and wounded. It wasn't a battle, it was an annihilation. The Ottoman Empire had lost its elite Janissary corps, its artillery train, its siege engineers, and most critically, its aura of inevitability. But here's where the story takes its dark turn, because this is where we need to talk about what happened after the victory. Sobieski entered Vienna as a conquering hero. The citizens who had endured 2 months of starvation and bombardment hailed him as the savior of Christendom. The Pope called him the defender of the faith. Artists began painting heroic portraits of the Polish king charging into battle. This was the moment of maximum glory, and it was a lie, or at least, it was an incomplete truth. Because while Sobieski was being celebrated in Vienna, his soldiers were engaged in an orgy of violence in the abandoned Ottoman camps. They massacred prisoners, they enslaved survivors, they looted not just military supplies, but personal possessions from dead bodies. The wounded were left to die in the fields. This wasn't a Christian army defeating Islamic invaders. This was one group of armed men inflicting maximum suffering on another group of armed men who had lost the ability to fight back. And what about Vienna itself? The city survived, but it was traumatized. Thousands of civilians had died during the siege. Buildings were destroyed. The economy was shattered. It would take decades to rebuild. The citizens who had cheered Sobieski would spend the next generation paying crippling taxes to the Habsburgs to fund the reconstruction. Many families were bankrupted. Veterans who had defended the walls found themselves begging in the streets because the government had no money to pay them pensions. Emperor Leopold, who had fled the city and left it to its fate, returned in triumph and claimed credit for the victory. He hadn't fought. He hadn't defended the walls. He had abandoned his capital and his people. But he was the emperor, and emperors write history. The official narrative became Leopold's steadfast leadership inspiring the defense, while Sobieski provided military support. Starhemberg, the man who actually held Vienna together during the darkest hours, was given a minor title and then largely forgotten by history. Now shift perspective to the Ottoman Empire. Kara Mustafa fled back to Belgrade, knowing what awaited him. The Sultan does not forgive failure, especially failure on this scale. In December 1683, messengers arrived with the Sultan's order. Kara Mustafa was to be executed. The method was precise according to Ottoman protocol for disgraced officials: strangulation with a silk bowstring. The Grand Vizier accepted his fate without resistance. He was strangled on December 25, 1683. His head was sent to Sultan Mehmed IV as proof of execution. But executing Kara Mustafa didn't solve the empire's problems. The defeat at Vienna triggered a cascading strategic disaster. The Holy League, a coalition of Austria, Poland, Venice, and later Russia, went on the offensive. They began systematically reconquering territories the Ottomans had held for generations. Hungary was liberated. Transylvania fell. Even parts of the Balkans began rebelling. The Ottoman Empire, which had been expanding for 300 years, suddenly found itself in permanent retreat. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the territorial losses. For centuries, European powers had lived in fear of Ottoman expansion. They had organized their foreign policies around the assumption that the Ottomans were an unstoppable force that could only be contained, never defeated. Vienna shattered that assumption. It proved that the Ottoman military, for all its sophistication and power, could be beaten decisively by a European coalition. That knowledge changed everything. Within the Ottoman court, recriminations and power struggles erupted. Competing factions blamed each other for the disaster. Some argued that Kara Mustafa's strategy was sound, but the execution was flawed. Others claimed the entire campaign was a mistake from the beginning. The Janissaries, who had lost thousands of their elite troops, became increasingly rebellious, eventually deposing Sultan Mehmed IV in 1687. The empire descended into political chaos that would continue for decades. Meanwhile, in Europe, the balance of power shifted permanently. The Habsburg dynasty, which had been on the defensive for generations, suddenly became an expansionist power. They absorbed former Ottoman territories in Hungary and the Balkans, transforming the Austrian Empire into a multi-ethnic powerhouse. This expansion created new problems, new ethnic tensions, new administrative challenges, but those were problems of success, not survival. Poland, ironically, gained the least from the victory. Sobieski returned home as a hero, but he couldn't translate military success into political power. The Polish nobility resisted his attempts at reform. The kingdom remained politically fragmented, economically weak, and militarily vulnerable. Less than a century later, Poland would be partitioned and erased from the map by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The savior of Vienna couldn't save his own kingdom. This is why we don't make Hollywood movies about Vienna 1683. Not really. Oh, there are paintings and commemorations and historical markers. The popular imagination doesn't gravitate toward this battle the way it does toward Thermopylae or Waterloo or D-Day, because Vienna doesn't fit the narrative we want. It's not a story of pure good defeating pure evil. It's not a last stand of heroic defenders against overwhelming odds because they were relieved. It's not even a story of brilliant military strategy, because the Ottoman defeat came from strategic arrogance and a lucky cavalry charge, not tactical genius. Vienna is the story of two empires colliding, one on the rise, one beginning its slow decline, and neither side emerging from the conflict morally clean or strategically transformed. It's a story about how military victories can mask political failures, how heroes in one context become irrelevant in another, and how the grand narratives of civilization versus barbarism collapse when you look at the actual details of what happened on the ground. The real lesson of Vienna isn't about cavalry charges or defensive sieges or religious conflict. It's about overreach. Kara Mustafa believed he could accomplish two objectives simultaneously: take Vienna and defeat the relief army. That overreach destroyed him and crippled his empire. Leopold believed he could abandon his capital and still claim credit for its defense. That cowardice tarnished his legitimacy and created resentment that would simmer for generations. Sobieski believed military glory would translate into political power. It didn't. Every commander, every emperor, every king involved in the Siege of Vienna made strategic miscalculations that cost thousands of lives and achieved outcomes none of them actually wanted. The Ottomans wanted to expand their empire. Instead, they began losing territory. The Habsburgs wanted to strengthen their position. Instead, they absorbed lands they couldn't effectively govern and ethnic populations they couldn't assimilate. The Poles wanted recognition and influence. Instead, they got temporary glory and long-term decline. And what about the civilians, the people of Vienna, who endured 2 months of siege, the camp followers in the Ottoman army who were massacred after the battle, the Hungarian villagers whose lands became battlefields for the next 16 years as the Holy League pushed the Ottomans back? History doesn't remember their names. There are no monuments to the anonymous dead. Their suffering was simply the price of geopolitics, the cost of imperial ambitions, the collateral damage of history. This is the ugly truth about Vienna, 1683. It was a decisive battle that changed the trajectory of European and Middle Eastern history. It marked the beginning of Ottoman decline and the rise of Austrian dominance in Central Europe. It demonstrated that European coalition forces could defeat the Ottoman military machine when properly organized and led. All of that is true and important, but it was also a pointless bloodbath that solved nothing, created new problems for every side involved, and left tens of thousands of corpses rotting in the fields outside Vienna, while emperors and kings posed for portraits and claimed victory. The soldiers who fought and died weren't fighting for civilization or faith or freedom. They were fighting because their rulers ordered them to fight, and those rulers were playing power games that most of the common soldiers couldn't even comprehend. When we study history, we have a choice. We can accept the heroic narratives, the simplified stories of good versus evil, the paintings of noble knights defending civilization. We can look deeper, examine the strategic failures, acknowledge the atrocities, recognize the moral complexity, and understand that history is not a story of progress or destiny, but a chaotic collision of human ambitions, mistakes, and consequences. Vienna, 1683, deserves to be remembered, but it deserves to be remembered accurately, not as a fairy tale of Christian Europe defeating Islamic invasion, but as a case study in how empires destroy themselves through overreach, how military victories can mask strategic failures, and how the costs of war are always paid by people who had no voice in the decisions that led to the fighting. The next time you see a painting of Jan III Sobieski leading his winged hussars down the Kahlenberg slopes, remember what came after that charge. Remember the looting, the massacres, the strangulation of Kara Mustafa, the political chaos in Poland, the ethnic conflicts in newly conquered Habsburg territories, the decades of continued warfare that followed. Remember that every empire that fought at Vienna eventually fell, that none of them achieved their strategic objectives in the long term, and that the only certainty was suffering. This is the real story of the Siege of Vienna, not a triumph of civilization, but a demonstration of how civilizations consume themselves and everyone caught in their machinery. History is not a story of heroes and villains. It's a story of humans making choices with incomplete information, pursuing objectives that often contradict each other, and dealing with consequences no predicted. Kara Mustafa died believing he had failed his sultan and dishonored his office. Emperor Leopold died believing he had saved his empire through divine providence. Jan III Sobieski died knowing his military glory hadn't translated into the political reforms Poland desperately needed. Count Starhemberg died largely forgotten, despite being the man who actually kept Vienna from falling. The common soldiers, the camp followers, the civilians, the slaves died without anyone bothering to record their names. And 3.5 centuries later, we're still arguing about what it all meant, still trying to extract lessons from the chaos, still painting heroic portraits and writing sanitized histories that make it all seem like it mattered in some grand narrative sense. Maybe it did. Maybe Vienna 1683 was a hinge point in history. Maybe it changed everything. Or maybe it was just another battle in an endless succession of battles. Another moment when humans killed each other over power and territory and called it destiny. You decide. History is not a settled question. It's an ongoing argument about what happened, why it happened, and what it means. The only thing we know for certain is that on September 12, 1683, tens of thousands of men died on the fields outside Vienna. Some fought for Allah, some fought for Christ, some fought because they were ordered to fight and had no choice. All of them bled the same color, screamed the same agonies, and died the same deaths. That's the story they don't teach in schools. That's the truth behind the paintings and the monuments and the heroic narratives. That's Vienna, 1683.